Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome as we take a deep dive first look at Bonaparte's Eastern Empire. Now this is a two-player game that covers Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 to 1801. One player takes the role of the French forces and the other player takes the role of Britain and her allies as they try to contest Napoleon's invasion. Andrew Rourke is the designer of this game, and this is the first game from a new company called Square Games. Tantalizingly, this is listed as their Limits of Glory system campaign number 1, so hopefully we'll see more games in this line in the future. Let's jump right in and take a deeper look. I'm very excited to show you this game. As always with the first look video, I have to say that I haven't played the game, but I have read through the rules and I've poured over all the components in preparation to make this first look video. And if I had to use a word to describe this game, I'm going to use innovative. I think as we look at the event and turn system, that's really fresh. I haven't seen one like it. We're looking at the combat system and how that models out combat. That's very clever as well. And then we'll take a look at this glory system that is really kind of an overarching currency that's based on your commanders that you use literally to execute kind of everything that you're going to do in the game. So it's a fascinating blend of novel mechanics that I'm really excited to show you. If we look at some of the gameplay specifics, this of course, as we can see by the map, is an area control movement game, and gameplay length is listed as 1.5 to 3 hours. That feels about right, although I'm going to guess some of your earlier games will probably go a little bit longer. Historical length is 3 years. The entire campaign is in here from the time the French fleet is trying to make landfall and navigating to try to make landfall in the area to Napoleon potentially dying or returning back to France. And the historical campaign, again, was 1798 to 1801, and the full campaign is modeled in the game here. Turn length specifically in and of itself is a little bit ambiguous. We'll talk about why as we see the event mechanic that kind of controls the flow of turns in the game. And then unit scale is ambiguous as well. The forces, although this is very much an operational game, there are 220,000 Ottoman forces in the area, 30,000 British forces, and then French forces had about 40,000 forces with the addition of about 10,000 sailors as well. So that gives you a rough idea of the game's scale here. Also modeled in the game, this was very much, there was a scientific element of this. This was the campaign during which the Rosetta Stone was discovered, and one of France's victory conditions is to get their savants, their scientific team, down to the Valley of Kings as one of their instant win victory conditions that they need to achieve. So there's a lot of kind of really interesting flair and mechanics that I think kind of weave together to create a recreation of this campaign. With that being said, let's jump in now and take a look at the rulebook. As we jump in and take a look at the rulebook, I do want to comment briefly on the art style, because I realized this did two things to me as I was kind of observing the game and before I started to dig in and take a look at the rules. This is a very unique kind of cartoonish type art style, which is evocative of the period and things. But at the same time, there's kind of a humorous edge to some of these drawings that made me wonder if perhaps this was a game that was almost taking a satirical approach to Napoleon's campaign in Egypt here. Just some of the style of the art has an element, kind of a cartoony edge to it. And so I wondered, like, is this a serious war game that's digging into this effort? And as much as I like the art to kind of evoke the period, I realize it did give me that possible interpretation. The rulebook has 40 pages, and I can tell from having read through this now, this is a very in-depth and creative look at this military campaign. So don't let the lighthearted and perhaps satirical edge to the artwork persuade you or lead you away from exploring the game as a serious historical kind of recreation or simulation of this time period and this event. There's a lot of unique mechanics in here, and it's very creatively done, and it's a very deep look at Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. 40 pages sounds like a lot, but the text is big. It's 2 columns, a lot of its examples, and we do have a good number of pieces of artwork in here to kind of explain things. With always the caveat that I haven't played the game yet, so it's hard to comment specifically on how good I think the rule set is, but as I've read through it, it's answered all my questions and I feel like I'm ready to play. And that I think is a good sign of this rulebook too, because there are a number of systems that I haven't really encountered in similar ways before. A couple of that I'd like to talk to now, one of which is this Limits of Glory system. And so the glory system in the game, it's almost like your side's energy as expressed in the commanders that you have. So every commander in the game, and as we look at the counters, there's quite a few of them. There's a hierarchy of commanders for each side, and commanders in specific areas are going to be what you use to basically lead to a lot of rerolls when you get outcomes that you don't want. So it's almost like energy you're using, this expendable energy you're using to influence things like movement and combat and disembarkation and things like that. So in a number of places in gameplay, you're going to be faced with the decision as to, do I want to burn some of this commander's glory to try to readjust this event? If so, how much do I want to do? And you're going to be, I think, constantly evaluating how much of this you have, where it is, what commanders are getting exhausted because they've used up all of their glory energy, if you would. It's a very creative system, and I'm really curious to see how it plays out in actual gameplay. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. The second thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the rules here is that this game is very much broken down into three different phases. The first phase is the invasion phase, and this is where the French fleet is trying to make landfall. Now, a couple things about this. This is the only phase of the game that I looked at and I said, okay, if you're going to play this game solitaire, playing both sides, you might have some issues here, because there are three fleets that you've got, and basically the French player is going to choose one of those is the real fleet, and two of them are dummy fleets. And you're basically moving those fleets around the Mediterranean, trying to deceive and trying to lead the British and their allies away from where the actual fleet is. And you're trying to accomplish two things in that phase. First of all, and this is where this shows up here on this chart, you're trying to see if you can visit Malta and then successfully make landfall without getting intercepted by the British forces. And here we can see the results of that. So if the French fleet has not visited Malta, if the French fleet has visited Malta, this is going to be your outcome. And you cross-index that whether it was intercepted at sea, intercepted while disembarking in Egypt, or disembarks in Egypt without being intercepted. So this here, where the French fleet has visited Malta and you were able to disembark in Egypt without being intercepted, means that Napoleon's starting army's force is going to be much bigger than if it's the polar opposite, which is you weren't able as the French to visit Malta and you got intercepted at sea before you're making landfall. This is the smallest French kind of starting for the next phase force, and this is the largest one. Now, this is actually part of the second phase of the game, which is this disembarkation phase. And I get a sense that the first phase, this invasion phase, which is kind of this cat and mouse phase with the French fleet and the British forces trying to track them down, is probably a smaller phase, likewise with the disembarkation phase. And then after the disembarkation phase, we come to what I'm perceiving is the biggest and the longest part of the game, which is the conquest phase. And this is basically where the French forces are trying to conquer Egypt and the British are trying to prevent that. There's combat on land and all sorts of things happening there. So I wanted to talk about those two mechanics because I think those really highlight a good part of the gameplay that's in the game and the structure of the game itself. Now, the question then begets itself, what's a potential solitaire rating and what is a potential just complexity of the game? I think the complexity of the game, despite the big rule book, the text is very big, lots of graphics, and they're not complex mechanics, and they're very well explained. So even though there's a good bit going on, I feel like there's been a lot of attempts to make this real clear to easy to understand. And after reading through it, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I got this. This doesn't seem all that tricky in that regard. I'm going to go with a 4 out of 10 for complexity. For solitaire rating, I think that invasion phase where you have the dummy fleets, you might need to kind of fiddle with that a little bit if you're trying to play both sides solitaire. The back of the box does say suitable for solo. I would give this a 5 out of 10 for solo. I think that's really the only place I've seen where it might be a little bit challenging to kind of recreate as the solo player. So I think perfectly playable solitaire, although there isn't a solitaire system, there's no solo bot and things like that, and the caveat that invasion phase where you have the dummy fleets is going to be a little bit tricky to replicate in a solo mode. Let's jump in now and take a look at our counter sheets. There are 4 of them, and they are all single-sided. So there's no step system in the game. We'll talk a little bit in a moment here how the units work. There are really kind of 4 different types of counters in the game. One is markers, things here like the momentum markers that determine when your turn is going to end. Then we have leaders. So these are the Ottoman Empire leaders, and there are 2 counters for each leader. One of these counters will be actually on the map representing the personage of this particular character. And then the other character, if I slide these out of the way, go here on the map on this tracking system. And this is where you use to track the glory rating of a particular leader. And of course, you're expending that person's glory to influence events in the campaign. And so that's going to be going down as the campaign proceeds. So that's the reason why there's 2 for each leader. So here we have Ottoman leaders, Ottoman ground forces. We can see these are Mamluk leaders and Mamluk ground forces. Then Bedouins are also modeled in the game here. Now, off to the side, so we get leaders, ground forces, markers, and then we also have these larger tiles. These represent kind of second level events. Keep these in mind, because when we take a look at the event turn track, we'll talk about how these work. But basically, you're going to drop these on the turn track after the first event at that number happens, to lead to a second level event that could happen if you roll that number again on a subsequent turn. It's a really cool system. It'll make more sense as we look at the turn track there. And so this is one of our 4 counter sets here. Here we have the British leaders and then British ground forces. These are Mamluk forces that can come into the game here as well. More of these event markers off to the side. And then if we go in here, French leaders, and then these are Ottoman Empire ground forces. I mean, here more momentum markers, victory point markers, because you're looking to get these kind of built up areas. We'll talk about victory in a while, but victory points are one of the deciding factors in the game if there isn't an instant win condition that's met as the game progresses. And then lastly, a whole counter sheet to itself. For these are the 3 potential fleets that we talked about, 2 of which could be dummy fleets. And then here are the French ground forces and then more French leaders here. We've got 4 different player aids in the game here. This is a very thick, nice, hefty piece of cardboard. And this is our kind of the turn event system. If you would, this tracks both your turns through the games and the events. And what basically, once you get to that conquest phase and the French forces are on the ground in Egypt and in the Middle East here, this is where you're going to start each turn with an event. And basically, as you start out, you're going to be rolling 1 die, and it's going to give you a number from 1 to 6. And this will tell you what event happens here. So for example, if you roll a 3, it's going to be French swap 1 infantry for 1 cavalry. But if we remember from the counter sets there is another 3. So once we've rolled that one and activated, and then the rest of the turn happens. At the end of that, once we've rolled that first 3, we're going to drop this secondary level 3 onto it. Then if we roll 3 again, it says if 1 dies 6, and this is the marker, you're going to be using 1 at first, immediately re-roll with 2d6. That means we're going to start to shift down into these second level events. So time is moving forward and a second tier events will be going on. So you immediately roll it with 2d6, and now it's more likely that you're going to get events down in this 2d6 row. And you have a little counter that marks this to tell you how many dice you're going to be rolling at the beginning of each turn to trigger the event. Then likewise, a couple of these 2d6 events are going to trigger you, say, okay, now we're going to add a 3rd die to your event die roll that are going to bring you more likely to bring you down into this 3rd level events. And you're going to be dropping on more of these cards as you roll. So if you get an 11, you're going to be rolling that, and that means that event is gone, and this event is more likely to trigger you to drop down. And as you go through, you get this progression of historical events that are somewhat sequenced by time, but not entirely, because every game you play is going to be different. Some of these will not happen. Some of these might happen and trigger things. The game flow might be faster in one game and a little bit slower in other games. It's a fascinatingly clever way to build in historical events but not tie you to a historical timeline. This looks really fun, really clever. I've not seen something like this before. As soon as I say that, someone's going to put in the comment, it's like, it reminds me of the event system from X game. I know that for sure. There's going to be ones out there that have used something like it, but this is the first time I've run into something like this. I think it's really clever, and I'm very interested to see how it plays out. The other player aid highlights the combat system. This is very clever as well. I'm not going to go into this one into such detail because it takes a while. I think it'd almost be like you'd have to teach it to explain it. But basically, you're going to be adding up the combat value of the units, the total strength points of your units that are in the area. So for example, if the French had, say, 17 strength points in a particular battle, you'd be using this column. Then you find over which one of these aspects you're going to pull. So here it is, French with or without commander. So if the French have 17 strength points, they're going to be using this row here. And then it tells you in this die roll system, which is all influenced by glory in terms of how you're spending glory, and both on the offensive and defensive, how many hits you're getting for the dice rolls that you end up with in that particular combat series. So, and this is the minimum number of total on your dice that you need. So it's this, it sounds complicated. I know I didn't do it justice in terms of explaining it, but what it does is it adds in the influence of leaders, the quality of of a particular nation or ally's troops, how much force is in there and how much damage they're going to do, all within this one intricate table without having to have a bunch of different tables or a bunch of different factors or units that have particular attack, offensive, and defensive values. Very clever system, and again, one I've not quite seen before executed in quite this way, so I'm very curious to see how this plays out. Lastly, I just want to point out the command charts, which are two thinner player aids that you're going to be using to kind of understand the hierarchy of leadership for each of the different sides. And this does play a role in gameplay. For example, if we look at the French command chart here, we can see Napoleon at the top, and then all his subsequent leaders and the leaders under them. Because for the most part, if you have a leader if you have leaders in a particular area, you're going to be using the highest leader can use the glory and influence in that particular area. So Napoleon at some point might split off leaders and troops and send them in different directions, and then subsequently splinter them off again. So you'll be kind of manipulating your leadership in the area to get leadership influence in areas where you really need it. And so that itself feels like it's going to be almost kind of an art form in terms of how you execute gameplay well. Before we jump in and take a look at the map, there's just a few other things to talk about. We get 8 dice with the game. These are used for a lot of the different activities. If you're trying to move units from region to region, you're going to be using, again, that glory and these dice in systems like that to see how well that activation goes. They're used in combat in a number of other places as well. And oftentimes you're looking for like a 5 or a 6 to be successful in an action, but again, your opponent or you can opt for rerolls and your opponent can force rerolls. So it's a really kind of a tight system that's going to be going back and forth in cohesion with that glory system for leaders. Then these are momentum markers. There are counters on the board that you can use in lieu of these, but if you want to use the wooden tokens to mark momentum in a particular, and this is basically the timing mechanic within your movement turn. So as you fail or execute things, you're going to be dropping momentum markers, and that means the play shifts to your opponent and it goes back and forth that way. So it's kind of tracking who's moving along through a particular turn. Then lastly, we have 2 combat markers that are used on the combat results table. These as well have physical cardboard counters to represent them as well. So you don't need the wooden tokens in the game. It's optional to use these if you prefer those over the wooden counters. Lastly, let's talk about our map. This is a nice thick mounted map of the area. Again, we can see area movement is a distinguishing factor here. 16.5 inches on the vertical here, and then 23.5 inches wide as we look at it. So a very modest footprint in terms of gameplay. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that we're looking at. And of course, we can see Mediterranean, the southeastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea here, Egypt down here with Cairo, and then Alexandria, 2 very important cities for the French. Malta is up here. Then over here we can see more Middle Eastern territories. And certain of these areas have these little banners on them. And these are what are called built-up areas, or as the game rules refer to them, BUAs. And these are the areas that are important for victory if neither side has won an instant victory. We'll come back to that momentarily. Before we do that, let's mention this big number tracking system over here. We mentioned that leader glory is a big element of the game, and each leader has their own token to sit on this tracking system as to how much glory they have. And that's where these counters are going, and you're basically reducing their glory as they expend energy in the area. This is also where you track victory points for the game, because that is the alternative if neither side, again, reaches an instant win condition. One last thing is that there is a connection down here that goes to Upper Egypt, which is up here, and then to to Upper Egypt, which is this section over here. So this chunk of the map is connected here and would extend off. Down here, then, we have the Valley of Kings. So getting to Valley of the Kings, you've got to come all the way up here, then up here into Cairo and Alexandria and things like that. One last thing before we talk about victory conditions, you'll notice that each area has a number in it, 1 or 2. This is largely determined for the ease of movement in and out of an area. So it's anything from 1, 2, 3, with the easiest being 4. And how a unit moves out of an area, it's not automatic. This is the number of dice you can roll to attempt to leave an area. Now, this can be influenced by both sides with the glory system. So the defender, like your opponent, can mess you up. You as leader can use your leaders to facilitate the movement out of an area. Again, creating this kind of very interesting mesh of glory with almost everything that happens in the game. But basically, say you want to try to move out of Cairo, which has a 4 here. If you're the French forces and you're down here and you want to move somewhere, you want to move your forces out, you roll 4 dice, and in order to succeed, you need a 5 or a 6 on only one of them. And if you get that, all of your units can move out of there. Now, you might, if you roll them once and don't get a 5 or a 6, or you get a couple of 5 or 6s, you could be like, okay, well, I'm going to use some of my glory to re-roll 2 dice to try to get better numbers. As a defender, after that happens, the defender, your opponent can use their glory, if there's some access to it in the area, to force you to re-roll one of the ones that were successful. So you don't quite know how many you're going to need or what's going to happen. And this plays out in combat as well. So it's a really very interesting system. I'm really curious to see how it plays out in actual gameplay, because you're also going to get a sense you're going to have to monitor where you want to expend that glory. You just can't use it willy-nilly, otherwise you're going to run out pretty soon. Now, so Cairo would be easy, right? As to move out of Cairo, you only need 1, 5, or a 6 on potentially 4 dice here. But notice that a lot of the areas have 1, which means these areas are going to be trickier to move out of, because you're only going to be able to roll 1 die and you need a 5 or 6. Again, with the caveat, this can be influenced by the leadership system and the glory system. So all these things together kind of show a little bit in terms of what the map is. Let's talk, however, about victory conditions. So the French can get an instant win if they control all of the built-up areas, these ones that have the banners, in Syria and Egypt, and get their savants, there's a counter for the savants, that scientific expedition, down to the Valley of Kings, because that was an important element of this campaign as well. If you do that, you get an instant win. Now, so if that doesn't happen, the British can get an instant win by controlling Cairo and Alexandria and making sure the French don't do that. The French must control these in order to stay in the game. So the British can get an instant win by basically crippling the foundation of the French campaign in the area. Now, if neither of that happens by the time you get to the end of the game, then what goes on then is the Treaty of Amiens, and if that happens, victory points determine the victor, with victory points being established by the numbers that are in these built-up areas for each side. So it's going to be a calculation of who controls most of the region that's going to determine victory for it. Now, there are some other elements in here too. For example, if Napoleon dies, it's 9 victory points to the British and their allies. If Napoleon makes it back to France, there's one point there's a limit where he can head back to France and successfully get back to France, then the French get 9 victory points for that. So again, a lot of different things going in here in a very clever system. Really curious to see how this one plays out. And so there we have it, a look at some of the mechanics, some of the counters, some of the gameplay, the map of Bonaparte's Eastern Empire. Very curious to see how this one plays out and how all these different systems work together. I think that event system for the turn-based elements and for capturing a historic timeline and yet not tying you to it looks really fascinating. The combat system, in terms of how to highlight the strength and influence of commanders and the strength of the different nationalities and types of units, that looks fascinating. The glory system looks really intriguing in how it mixes with the hierarchy of units and how movement works. And the victory conditions, it's a fascinatingly thoughtful creation here of Bonaparte's campaign in Egypt. The big question remains is, how does it play? I'm looking forward to digging into that soon. Thanks everybody for watching. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. If you enjoyed this first look video and are looking for other Napoleonic war games as well, I might guide you to our first look video here of 1807. Thanks for watching again, everybody. Have a great day.